We sometimes get captured by these big ideas, and yes, we have the opportunity to maybe restore 1 trillion trees or 1 billion hectares or however you want to talk about it. But then in this enthusiasm, it often then leapfrogs to discussions around the big finance and how can we do it at scale, which is very important, but that could forget all the little efforts that currently make up restoration and that might then not be tied to that scale that we're trying to achieve.
Hey, I am Michael Yadrick. I'm an ecological restoration practitioner, restoration monger, co-creator of the Arbutus Army, winter Piaggio scooter rider, and trail runner, living on unceded Puyallup territory now known as the City of Destiny, Grit City, Tacoma, Washington. This is Tree Hugger Podcast, where we discuss the potential emergence of global restoration culture, part of ongoing coverage of the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. I am broadcasting as a guest to this Coast Salish territory. I acknowledge that I work, rest, and play on the ancestral homelands of the Puyallup, Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. I seek to understand my place within that history while disrupting further claims to indigenous land in our practice of ecological restoration. If you don't know whose land you are on, please feel free to find the link that I have provided in the show description, in the show notes, or navigate to native-land.ca right now to identify to whom the land belongs. Some new podcast statistics came out lately. There are over 850,000 active podcasts. If you include hibernating shows, that number may jump to 1.7 million. While you have your choice of millions of shows out there about true crime, or chess, or kitties, or baseball, or QAnon conspiracies, I'm grateful that you found Tree Hugger Podcast one more time amongst all your ever-changing options. If you have 5 minutes, I would love for you to complete a short listener survey I put together. It is succinct and to the point. That's what succinct means. One can find the link right now in the show description in your app, the Tree Hugger website, or the Tree Hugger Instagram profile. There are just a few questions about preferred length of the episodes, where you found me, your desires, what you might hate. That's it. And if you submit something and drop your mailing address, I will send you a Tree Hugger sticker. Boom. If you opened up the survey when I first started talking about it, you would probably be done by now. On with the show. On this episode, we are going to catch up with the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. We are in it. Do you feel empowered yet? I may be one of the only podcasts out there covering the Restoration Decade, which is a uniting effort focused on the protection and revival of ecosystems all around the world. It aims to halt the degradation of ecosystems and restore them to achieve global goals. My guest on this episode is Ann-Kathrin Neureuther, who is based in Berlin and recently joined the United Nations Environment Program as Communication Manager for the UN Decade. Over the past 10 years, Ann-Kathrin has worked in Germany, Egypt, and Indonesia for the United Nations and other international organizations, research institutes, and global NGOs, from which she took a deep appreciation for pop culture as connector of people and some useful but polishable language skills. She cares about the great outdoors, especially canyons, caves, and mountains. And she is a self-proclaimed podcast, board game, book, and TV nerd, and does a little bit of boxing in her spare time. Her job is to communicate the gigantic restoration initiative that joins forces with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, focused on resisting climate change, protecting and improving the well-being of local populations, and preserving biodiversity. Ann-Kathrin will help walk us through the decade strategy, which frames the problem like this. The objectives of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development will not be achieved without large-scale restoration of degraded terrestrial, freshwater, and marine ecosystems globally. The vision is a world where, for the health and well-being of all life on Earth and that of future generations, we have restored the relationship between humans and nature by increasing the area of healthy ecosystems and by putting a stop to their loss, fragmentation, and degradation. The year 2030 features visibly in Restoration Decade and Sustainable Development discussions. This is the deadline by which the 193 UN member states have committed to achieving the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that constitute a global action policy for people, the planet, and prosperity. It is also the year in which average global temperatures will likely surpass pre-industrial levels by 1.5 degrees centigrade. Accordingly, I'm going to highlight some of the more notable actions and things I talk about with Ann-Kathrin that appear in the strategy for the UN decade that help to build a generation restoration. And these also really relate to just about any restoration program, but really are upscaled to this global restoration phenomenon. Number 1, empower a global movement and culture of restoration. When I talked to Tim Christofferson in early 2020, he emphasized this decade would perhaps be more of a cultural challenge than science contest. The United Nations Environment Program states that no single entity can steer the course in this endeavor. The decade is therefore designed to connect and empower the actions of many decentralized actors. Groups and individuals can contribute to restoration wherever and however they choose. We don't just need people planting trees or growing corals. We need all shades of tree hugger, as well as storytellers, guides, experimenters, builders, disruptors, caregivers, and healers. 2, finance restoration on the ground. Our societies have been funneling resources through extractive and racialized capitalism straight into a complicated medley of environmental crises. In response, the breadth of restoration required will gobble up funding to support boots on the ground and flippers in the water, which up until this time has faced perpetual financial insecurity. Billions are needed from governments, international lenders, development agencies, and private businesses. Individuals like you and me can invest their time and energy as a shareholder in the process. 3, set the right incentives and shift behaviors. Global trends often result in decline of local environmental health. Restoration makes us feel awesome, but we are often rewarded with more degradation and destruction to help fix. Part of the culture is redirecting global subsidies going into industrial agriculture, petrochemical, and fishing ventures to finance more worthwhile regenerative practices in restoration. Recovery of ecosystems can produce abundance, secure livelihoods, and reverse pollution that is harming us or our kin. 4, celebrate leadership. Do you think we are reaching peak tree planting? Under the Bond Challenge, more than 60 countries have promised to restore 350 million hectares of forest landscapes. We hope these efforts are dedicated on lands that are appropriate for forests and do not further separate people from the land. Comprising less than 5% of the world's population, indigenous people have protected 80% of global biodiversity since time immemorial. We should celebrate their governance and worldview and challenge others to fulfill their obligations. 5, invest in research. Conservation and restoration has focused for a long time on resisting changes and maintaining historical and current conditions. While this may be appropriate for some ecosystems, disruptions to our climate from a few centuries of greenhouse gas emissions is changing our landscapes. I expect that a complementary effort of Western and indigenous scientific understanding of ecosystem change will help us shift towards resilience or transformative restoration strategies. 6, we need to develop capacity. Restoration is happening right now somewhere while you listen to this podcast. This podcast is not restoration, I hope, because we are communicating the science and culture of the endeavor. The Restoration Decade is obligated to take restoration projects to scale, while also centering and elevating frontline communities that do and will continue to suffer the most from the continued destruction of ecosystems, such as indigenous peoples, women, non-binary folks, and youth. 7, amplify the next generation. Even though I like Fridays for Future, Greta, Vic Barrett, Jamie Margolin, Shia Bastida, and more, youth should have the right to be youth. I would much prefer they are out there interacting with their ecosystems than fighting for their existence. They have been impacted by inaction of their elders and my generation who haven't responded to the slow creep of climate change and or even the rapid destruction of ecosystems. It is youth that also stand to benefit the most from the Green New Deal package and a restoration economy. Ann-Kathrin talks about youth engagement at length in our discussion on this episode, so embracing youth as multidimensional and equals could be the decade's longest living legacy. So I'm so glad to bring you this update. It starts right here. Enjoy this conversation with Ann-Kathrin.
All right. So thanks for your time. It was a little less than a year ago that I talked with Tim Christofferson, and it was
Wow.
really,
Already.
it was like time's flying by.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really interesting to hear how the decade at that point in time was just like a baby decade, baby idea. And I feel like you all are making some moves. And
maybe a toddler now.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
it's very demanding.
And the team seems to be growing, and there's strategies and documents and tweets going out. So I'm really I'm really happy to have you on to talk more about it. So to start off, can you just give the listeners and me a little bit more background on yourself and how you came to be at the United Nations Environment Program?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Ann-Kathrin Neureuther, originally from Germany and living in Berlin right now, as I said, but I've spent a lot of my time abroad, actually, living in Indonesia for 5 years, also spent some time in Egypt, 1.5 years in the UK, in the US, and really different places, and joined the decade now as communications manager. And before that, I've been working in the environmental field for a long time and always at the intersection between environment, communication, science. One thing I did, for example, for a longer time while I was in Indonesia was working on the Global Landscapes Forum and building that up from its inception, which was with the Warsaw COP in 2013 until 2017. And then I transitioned into different roles, looked into behavior change and the environment because I thought that was a really interesting topic and how we can go beyond communication and actually achieving behavioral change, but also how that intersects with policy and with the barriers we're all facing. And I had this really interesting opportunity, and the decade came up, and that has always been close to my heart. And now I'm here with a team since September this year. So really around the time when we revealed the strategy and started with our broad engagement and bringing in more partners. So that's been really exciting up until now.
Well, congratulations. And the team, you say your team, who's like on the team?
Yeah, it's still pretty nimble, I must say. So the decade is not meant to be a huge institution or secretariat by itself. It's rather small, coordinating and really shedding light on all the restoration efforts that are already ongoing. So the two agencies, UN agencies being tasked with leading the decade are the UN Environment Program and the Food and Agriculture Organization. And we have a coordination team between those with focal points. So Tim is the focal point for UNEP side. And then there's Mette Wilkie and Eduardo Mansour, the directors for forestry and climate, respectively, at FAO. But they all still have their day jobs. So they're the focal points for our institutions, but not working 100% as the decade secretariat. So I was actually the first to join as the UN Decade staff for communications and providing the link between the UNEP communications program and the UN Decade. And now we also have a colleague working on partnerships, which is super important at the moment. And that's it, pretty much. And of course, looking at the launch, the team will grow, but it's not our intention to have this big office or mechanism for the decade. The power really lies in all the strategic and other partners that we're working with.
I got it. All right. Nimble. That's a good word for it.
Nimble, but it's however small or huge you look at it, I guess, and how much you zoom in, because you could also say that we're already hundreds of people and that we're already the biggest restoration organization in the world, probably, if you look at the work that our task forces are doing, for example, which are voluntary efforts. So we have a task force on monitoring now, led by some experts and really digital powerhouses at FAO. We have a task force on good practices, also led by colleagues at FAO. But these task forces then again bring together more than 80 organizations and hundreds of individuals working on these efforts. And we've seen that really as a great way for fostering this spontaneous collaboration. So whoever's interested in working in the field of restoration and saying they want to contribute to monitoring the decade, they are welcome to join the task force. And we're seeing a lot of action and concrete work coming out of that, such as a monitoring framework for the decade, which will be launching next year's geospatial platform, supporting that monitoring. And based on that model that we've seen work really well, we're now setting up task forces for communication, for youth, for finance. And it's a really new way for us to approach things, but also very exciting.
Excellent. So you said a few things. Yeah, I really want to unpack. So
Please.
the strategy. So when I talked to Tim Christopherson earlier in the year, he just alluded to the strategy. I followed it, but I'm not sure if everyone else did. I'm really interested in the framework and how you all went about building the strategy. I know there was some crowdsourcing and surveys, and then some like very personal engagement that went into it as well. Could you tell us a little bit more about how that moved forward?
So I was actually also lucky enough to be involved in the strategy process back then with a partner organization and more in a consulting function. So we started off with organizing stakeholder consultations and workshops in 2019. So pretty much starting last year along the 3 Rio conventions. So we had some discussions tied to the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, the UNCCD, the UNFCCC, which is a climate convention, and the CBD, the biodiversity convention. We also attended Climate Summit, the Secretary General's Climate Summit in New York last year, and just used all of these global opportunities across continents to get people together, talk about the decade. And that was mainly from organizations in our space, international organizations, but also youth representatives, indigenous peoples representatives, some conversations with journalists. And then based off what we got from these larger workshops and consultations, we started to do a deep dive. And I work closely together with my colleague Anthony Mills, who's a consultant based in South Africa with an organization looking at ecosystem restoration, really an expert in building these huge restoration programs. He was tasked with writing the content part of the strategy or assembling that, whereas I led on the communication side. And together we had interviews I recently counted with 136 individuals, or that was at least my list, really personal interviews, conversations. And for me, those ranged from the types of organizations or individuals that I described, but also filmmakers, also leaders of startups, digital innovators, journalists. And one conversation basically led to another. And we talked to individuals and they told us to look in this side of restoration or talk to people representing this and that ecosystem or this and that sector. And based on these conversations, we then started drafting the strategies with some substantive feedback, again, by colleagues. And then after that, it went into this really detailed process of making the strategies publicly available for everyone to comment on. And that then led to more than 2,500 comments, including from member states, basically across the world, but also universities, civil society organizations, NGOs, indigenous peoples, and also some people from culture. So that was really interesting. And then the strategy was again informed by these rounds of comments, and then finally revealed to the world on 15th of September. But really, this engaging and movement-based approach didn't stop then with the reveal, but it's rather that the strategy reflects our entire approach to this decade. And we just took it forward from there. So a lot of people we met in the strategy process are now members of these task forces that I described, or members of a database we have with more than 450 restoration practitioners.
It sounds like the most thorough process I've ever heard about. That's incredible. But it doesn't sound like it's too foreign to you. Do you recall anything that really stood out about what the kids and what the youth had to say? So a lot of your research has really gone into values and how those are communicated, and the morals that sometimes they espouse are so concrete about how the climate disruption is affecting them and their future and the generations to come. So I think I can imagine that comes out, but I don't know how else they might engage more broadly about restoration in general too.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There was actually so much substance coming out of these discussions, and youth is not just this one big coherent block, where you could say, okay, I met a 17-year-old on the subway yesterday, so I consulted youth, which is actually the number one point I wanted to highlight, and that we really also learned in the process and now take very seriously is the question of youth representation. Because in these processes, often there are youth consultations, young people speak at events, etc. But the young folks we talk to, they're also very much interested in the political processes, who we engage with, and on what basis. Sometimes much more than the quote unquote adult organizations I talk to. But I think this is also because they're being sensitized to this question, because it does unfortunately appear to happen that young people are invited to events and that then gets shipped or framed as the youth engagement. And we've spoken to youth and we took the youth seriously. Whereas on the other hand, you would not necessarily do that with other communities. You wouldn't interview one forestry scientist and then say, the consensus in forestry science is, and the forestry science tells us, because I think there's maybe also more of a history of having these processes and discourses organized. So that was my number one lesson, actually, that the representation and the way we frame it, and that this representation and the terms are actually supported by youth themselves and developed by youth themselves, and that youth themselves also determine who is part of these conversations, because often if you look at youth as a monolithic stakeholder group, you might forget the intersectionality, and that it's not only about the age differences, but there's also differences among the different youth and among the different regions they represent and among the different corners they come from. And so the youth focal points we work with take that very seriously. So having these vertical and horizontal representation, as they call it. So also seeing that within youth, they have different stakeholder groups represented. So that was one point they made very strongly, and which is now informing our work on youth task forces and how we want to engage youth going forward. And we actually now asked our youth counterpart to write the TOR and their processes for themselves. So that's happening at the moment, and they are consulting again with different organizations. Another interesting point I got was, and that's more to the topic of restoration or how we talk about restoration in general, but during one of the consultations, one young person who's very much working on the ground with the restoration initiative in Bolivia said that what the decade should avoid is this, as he called it, rush to scale. Because we sometimes get captured by these big ideas, and yes, we have the opportunity to maybe restore 1 trillion trees or 1 billion hectares or however you want to talk about it. But then in this enthusiasm, it often then leapfrogs to discussions around the big finance and how can we do it at scale, which is very important, but that could forget all the little efforts that currently make up restoration and that might then not be tied to that scale that we're trying to achieve. So that was just his very personal perspective from somebody working as a young person in a rather small organization. But there was also something that we very much then considered in the strategy, and that actually informed the strategy's movement-based approach and looking at the missing middle, as we sometimes call it. So in between all the private citizens and in between all the big restoration efforts, there's also a lot of often underfunded and undervalued smaller restoration efforts going on the ground. Mm-hmm. And then thirdly, what youth were also very sensitive to and we also took very seriously is that, I mean, it's not a secret. We've seen a lot of action by youth in the past years. We've been very impressed by the action that Fridays for Futures and other are taking. And then sometimes there's this tendency to say, oh, yes, look at Fridays for Future and look at all these youth movements. We have to involve youth and we have to see how youth can help us achieve restoration. However, that can also be perceived somewhat as shifting the burden again to youth who are basically just calling us adults out to take issues more seriously. I think that's the point that Greta Thunberg is also making over and over again, that it should not be youth actually taking on these issues. And it's actually a sad situation that it has to be youth. And so what we are also looking at in the strategy and now in the implementation is how can we take youth seriously as the ones that undoubtedly would suffer the most from the climate catastrophe, but who would also benefit the most from a restoration economy. And so how can the decade also help to build these skills, to have meaningful engagement and opportunities for youth, to foster ecopreneurship, job opportunities, etc.
That's so powerful. That's substantive. None of these groups you talk about them as kind of categories, but there's millions of them, youth in the world, and just There's like different shades of youth. So that's important to remember. So where can people find this strategy? I encourage everyone to read it, but I'm not sure they're going to, but let's just tell them where it is.
It's www.decadeonrestoration.org /strategy. But you can also go to the main site and just find your way around with the menu function. It's available as full strategy in English right now, but we also have the summary strategy translated in 8 languages, the 6 UN languages, and then Portuguese and Swahili. We also have a very nice summary blog on the strategy, which you can find on the site. If you don't want to read the full strategy, you can get it in 10 easy points that break down the major calls of the strategy and also let different people know what they can do in support of the UN decade. And we're just now working on more translations, so the strategy should be available in all UN languages soon.
So you're really like living the strategy right now, right? Like these consultations started in 2019 and we're not really officially into the decade yet, but when there's all these intentions into the strategy, and it sounds like it's going to evolve over the next 10 years and that like it's not just a document and you're going to like boom, boom, boom. When does the decade officially start for most people?
Yesterday or on 15 September. So that's again a tricky question, just as a question, how big is the decade's team? And you could either say it's one person or it's 1,000.
I was wondering if there's like a training, a United Nations training where there's like, here's how you do decades. Was there an orientation?
No,
like
there's no orientation. It's just, but I have to say that we have spoken to teams of previous decades, of biodiversity decade, factoring in lessons learned from there. And we're also very closely working with the UN decade on ocean science, which is the other decade that's going on right now. And that's actually also co-led by UNEP and has a lot of overlap. And they are actually somewhat taking a similar approach, although with a different audience in mind, but also in doing it very openly. So the decade started, I would say, with the reveal of the strategy on 15 September, because that's when we let everyone know what our intentions were, what we think is needed for restoration, and what different groups and people can contribute to restoration, and what we call on governments and other entities to further scale or do in support of restoration. But then the alternative start date, of course, that you could see is the public facing launch of the decade, where we really step outside of our usual club and allies and audiences and have mass outreach to hundreds of millions of people across the globe. And that will happen with World Environment Day on 5th of June, 2021, which is really a key date to get the world focused around environmental issues and setting the agenda.
All right. So it's coming. So yeah, some benchmarks have passed, and then the next one is going to be in June on World Environment Day.
Yeah. Awesome. And everything in between. We actually put together a guide, at least for our partner organizations, what they can do now, what we can do together, and what we can achieve for this decade. So there's already a lot of material online. Actually, if you go to the website that I described, www.decadeonrestoration.org, we have communication tools, social media cards, videos, the logo and the hashtags in all kinds of different languages, blog posts coming out, a social media wall where everyone using the hashtag Generation Restoration can get their posts and stories featured. So there's already numerous ways to get engaged with the decade now and to act as an ambassador for ecosystems and to make the vision known in your community.
So one thing I just saw was a press release where y'all just announced these like Earth heroes, right?
Champions of the Earth, yeah.
Champions of the Earth. So you just gave this Lifetime Achievement Award to Robert Bullard, which is who's an environmental justice advocate in the United States, and in some people's minds was like kind of the grandfather of environmental justice in the United States, at least.
Yep.
And I'm wondering how environmental justice plays in centering people's rights to a healthy environment and how that really plays into your framing of the restoration decade.
This is huge. And I know there's a lot of discussions in the US, but it's a global phenomenon, of course, that the poorest and most disadvantaged people are often the ones suffering most from the consequences. We know that about 40% of people worldwide, 3.2 billion people, are suffering from degraded ecosystems, from dirty and polluted rivers, and from degraded soils, which undercuts the food security. So on that very big and global scale, restoration is very much interlinked with environmental justice, because bringing back these landscapes and ecosystems to health and productivity will then also support the livelihoods of these marginalized communities. But what we are also being aware of, and that's the other dimension of environmental justice, is looking at who's already engaged, who's part of the conversation around restoration, for example, and how can we make sure that we make this decade open for different efforts, for different communities. More than half of people live in cities nowadays. So it's a big question about what can we do for restoration in our immediate surroundings? How can we use it to help fight impacts of climate change, air pollution, and also get people involved where they live? How can we work together with urban communities or with communities who maybe traditionally haven't been as linked to the environmental discourse? So we're working with very interesting organizations as well through our US team that are working with BIPOC communities and bringing them into restoration efforts in urban areas. Urban gardening is a big topic. So, and of course, that's not what I actively do every day. I would be very busy, and that's not what my other 2 to 3 colleagues are doing. But what the decade is really trying to do is build this movement and bring all these efforts together and shed a light on them and showcase them. And this is also why we're working on communication efforts as a priority, and on this digital hub, which we'll eventually have, where you can really then click around and see the massive movement that's already out there for restoration, but that may be invisible right now.
Excellent. Is there any projects that come to mind that are highlights for you that can give people a sense of like what it looks like on the ground? Because it is like individuals or entities or civil society or states actually motivating and making the magic happen. Is there anyone getting it right, or is there any like really tantalizing projects that you could highlight for us?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the decade also will work with flagship projects where we pay special attention to. And the first flagship selected now is the Great Green Wall in Africa, where a lot of our colleagues from FAO, from UNEP, from the UNCCD are already working on the ground. And it's this massive effort of connectivity really across Africa, from Ethiopia to Senegal. And so this will be highlighted under the decade. And of course, that's a massive story in itself that I couldn't do justice here to unpack. But it's also all these little efforts, and not little efforts maybe, but these things that you stumble across that you wouldn't have heard about otherwise if there wasn't this buzz around the decade right now. So what's happening in our inboxes since we revealed the strategy is unbelievable. There's hundreds of emails and organizations telling us, I want to be engaged in the decade. How can my initiative here of the Teachers Association in Nigeria contribute to this decade and this effort? And that's, for me, it's very inspiring. But our goal is really to make it as inspiring to the people in the world who may not have heard about it. And this is why this digital hub and the communication efforts are so central. Just to pick one story that reached me last week through one of my colleagues from Brazil is that there are these leading scientific organizations on restoration in Brazil teaming up with conservation organizations right now to plant a memory forest of 200,000 trees in memory of the 200,000 COVID-19 victims in Brazil so far, with they do together with the families of these victims. So families can basically sponsor a tree in memory of their loved ones. And so this was really powerful for me because it connects restoration really to the aspect of restoring our relationship with nature, and B, also maybe restoring something in ourselves that might have been broken. And it shows that tree planting is really much more than the easy carbon fix solution. Trees and restoring ecosystems and these ideas are also really symbols of hope. So that's the emotional aspect that really caught me about this story. But secondly, they also doing it in a very smart way. As I said, there's leading scientific organizations behind this effort, and they using it to create more connectivity between some very crucial corridors in Brazil. So, and a lot for the efforts to increase the population of the lion tamarin that has been critically endangered, but now went to endangered status just since increased restoration efforts were taking place. And so this project will also help to further these efforts.
Those are good ones to check out. Cool. Is there this is a random question. I don't expect you to have an answer. Is there any way that podcasters can help and get involved? Have you thought about this in your communication strategy?
Yes.
I don't know. You mentioned a podcast earlier on, and so I was like, oh, she listens to podcasts.
I'm personally really into podcasts, and so one of my favorite. Yes, what a coincidence!
How much we have in common.
Now we're both on a podcast. How come? And so when we did our analysis of different communication tools and channels, podcasts actually, did come up. I mean, it's the medium is growing. I don't have to tell you anything more about the podcasts themselves, but
that was my input on the survey. You probably read my
yeah. But what we also found is that doing podcasts and doing them well is incredibly challenging. And so our strategy actually is to not put out, the UN Decade podcasts, because it's very time consuming, and it's also again, in line with the entire strategy, much more worthwhile to get other folks engaged in the restoration movement and to have them tell the story of restoration, the opportunities with their expertise and their perspective. So the strategy does explicitly invite makers and producers of culture from the media, from writers to podcasters to film producers to take part in the decade. And what we really can do in our coordinating function is help connect podcasters to stories such as the memory forest in Brazil or people living in the Great Green Wall area talking about what it has done for their livelihoods, showcasing all the amazing restoration stories we have through different media, and then again connecting these media to this amazing content and really visionary ideas that are out there.
Awesome. The international conference for the Society for Ecological Restoration is coming up in June 2021, right? So
we are working with them. So it's coming up in the lead up. So they're one of our big partners, and this is not a coincidence. So the conference is going to be after the launch, but there's going to be week-long campaigns for having your own restoration events, restoration tours on the ground. So that's what the SER is partnering with us on.
Like, I would encourage you probably not to start broadcasting. Probably if you can get people to broadcast your message out for you, it's probably better if they do it well, right? So I've been considering like this call for ideas or abstracts is out right now. So I was just considering some different ideas and trying to think about some really compelling video that I could put together.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's why we're also putting together the different channels where the products that are coming out in the coming years can be hosted and also made accessible to the global community. So it's really this three-way movement between you have the restorers on the ground, you have the storytellers, you have the global audience who then hopefully gets inspired, who hopefully urges for change from their governments and corporates, but who hopefully may also get involved in restoration themselves, leading to more restoration projects, leading to more stories around restoration.
Yeah, so, it is good. I think, definitely there's lots of stories to be told. And I think really the best podcast is really like you're listening into like, you're almost eavesdropping on these really rich, almost private conversations, you know? You get a little bit of insight and, you know, you can relax, but also challenge yourself, but also sometimes it can just be a non-stressful way to take in information.
Yeah, and for me, I personally always listen to podcasts while cooking in the kitchen when I'm cooking alone, because it feels like having somebody there, having a conversation, basically. I mean, you're listening in, but it's the equivalent to a conversation, and it makes you think, and it reaches you in a different way than music would. So that's my personal podcast experience. It's
that's good to know.
True crime and spaghetti with fresh pesto. You know?
True crime. Oh my God. Yeah, that's what I just said. It can be very non-stressful. But then my wife, her favorite genre is like murder. It's like true crime. I think you all have stuff in common too. But I was like, what are you doing? What are you listening to? She's like, murder. And that's all she says. And
well, I feel with true crime, it's not necessarily like the violent or crime aspect. It's this, what I really love about it, you're taken on a journey and you're seeing the story unfold through the eye of the podcaster, because it's basically an investigation. So as they are learning new information, you're learning new information. And that's for me the fascinating thing. It wouldn't even have to be around violent crime. So one of my life dreams is to have a big podcast produced on environmental crime, an investigative environmental podcast that really, you know, is sort of, I don't know if I am allowed to name drop here, but you know, the serial for deforestation. If some of you podcasters could go out there and make that happen,
yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, if I had more time.
So just putting it out there.
Yeah. What other crimes are there then? I know. Yeah. So like illegal logging, those sort of like getting down dirty, like on the
or maybe Yeah, you could maybe also do a positive spin. I don't know, how the heck did this forest get restored? We get to the bottom of it. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the fascination of true crime, I guess, is in the investigative part, right?
All right. Well, switching gears here, there's a question I ask everyone is, what is your favorite tree, if you have one?
Yeah, I would say, okay, and I don't know if that reflects well on me. It's an acacia tree. I love acacias. They are obviously not native to the environment I grew up in. So there's for non-native tree species, but I actually grew up in Acacia Street, where they planted a lot of acacias when our houses were built, and then later found out that the roots were not really something that works along with roads and traffic, etc., because they come up through the pavement, so they had to take down the acacias again. I was very sad. I went to City Hall, 12 years old, complained about the situation, and still like eating acacia honey. So I guess that's my connection.
Excellent. That's a good one. Were there thorns and issues with the thorns as well?
On top or in the higher levels, but the issue was more with the roots, because I think those were flat rooted. And so that's not really something, to city developers out there if you're planning a street. Okay. Not the best street.
This is just a totally literal question. In my Peace Corps service in Bolivia, and there's acacia. And so riding our bikes, I had to put like another layer of like rubber essentially inside my bike tire. We were always popping tires. So you see people on this side of the road just always fixing tires because they're just like, you'd randomly just hit a thorn.
Yeah. No, they had them on the branches, but then I guess they didn't fall off to the street. Yeah. But I just found them so pretty always. And they added sort of that exotic flair to the neighborhood, to my very German village neighborhood. So.
All right. So really wrapping up, I think the biggest question with people is like, what is this decade all about? Because it can be so big, but I think it is so personal at the same time, where it is really up to us to make it what it's going to be. And I think it's one thing right now when we're talking in late 2020, but it's going to change, I think, over the course of the decade. So anything you're imagining about how the decade's going to progress, and then if you can let people know how we can get involved, that would be great.
Yeah, visit the website, use our communication tools. We were very conscious about developing a logo that is very simple, very intuitive, ties to restoration, and can be drawn by a school child in the margins of a page, but also be printed at a restoration site where people don't have access to, high-end technology. So we're already seeing the logo popping up actually as an identifier for this common global cause across the world, across restoration sites from peatlands in Ireland to, forests in India. So we absolutely encourage you to identify yourself with a decade. There's no formal approval process for using this visual identity, or for indeed talking about the decade, holding your own events, talking about restoration, what restoration means to you. It's not all about forests either, although we love forests, of course, and trees, but the decade covers all ecosystems from terrestrial to marine, from the peaks of the mountains to the depths of the sea. So grasslands, and everyone should get to know their local ecosystems, what they can do for them, or their ecosystems of passion, if you're passionate about an ecosystem elsewhere, and find out how you can support that. And then, of course, looking at the launch with World Environment Day, there will be opportunities to host your own events, to make them public through the website. We'll have options for registering your own events to the website, registering your own profiles, connecting to the global restoration community, and eventually through this digital hub we'll find out who's doing restoration where and how can people connect to them in their immediate surroundings. So that's really a big vision, because as you say, it's a huge vision. It's more than 1 billion hectares we want to revive by the end of this decade. But at the same time, it's all these little small steps that are too big for any one entity, including the UN, to take. So it needs all of us.
Cool. There was a tweet that went out. It showed like a billboard. It was just cool. It showed like a name of a project and then had the identity on there, which I don't know exactly what it is, but it's some wavy lines. It's beautiful. Can you explain what it is?
Yeah, sure. So we thought about it a lot. As we said, we wanted to have it very simple and symbolic. So the identity really reflects different ecosystems, from the water ecosystem to the forest to the orange for the farmlands. It's tied to the identity of the Sustainable Development Goals. So the color scheme relates to the colors of the SDGs that will be most closely linked to the decade. So eradicating poverty, zero hunger is the orange, life on land and life below water, and climate action. And it also has this heart, which is a symbol for revival, for the living things of ecosystems. And we just wanted to create a visual identity that's up for interpretation, that is not, a tree, so that the ocean folks think, oh, that this is not for me, and that is really easy to take up and replicate. And this symbol, that this is actually the peatland in Ireland I mentioned, and I was really happy seeing it because it just popped up on my Twitter wall, and we didn't know about it, and we didn't know this organization, we didn't know this project was getting started, but it just launched, and it associated itself with the decade, and that was just really beautiful.
I was thinking, I was like, maybe we should make a billboard.
You should.
No one's responded to me that question yet. But I was also thinking like some graffiti thing, like a stencil, and like some maybe biodegradable sort of paint.
That would be super cool. We actually see a lot of creativity now. We had this student groups from the United Arab Emirates who actually launched a competition around the logo to get it more adapted to the Arab context. And they had some really cool stuff coming up, with their national bird featuring in the logo instead of the heart, with their flag featuring in the logo, with trees that were native to their drylands and environments. So
we can make it red, white, and blue. Is that okay?
Yeah, please
Americanize
go for it.
Kind of America it. Okay. An American.
Full permission to Americanize it.
All right. Well, thank you for your time. It's really good to meet you. I'm glad we get to keep familiar with the decade, and I really want to keep tracking it over time. So really welcome aboard. Congratulations on the new gig. And I hope, it's both exciting and you can find some time to relax as you ramp up to the launch. And we're here to support you.
Yeah, no, there's no time for relaxation now. We're all energized, and we all working really hard on getting the systems going and getting the infrastructure in place for the decade to feature all of your efforts. Feel free to reach out as well, talking to practitioners on the ground, to people from the Great Green Wall, from the Memory Forest, from the Aral Sea. We're in touch with all these amazing initiatives, so it might be great to showcase some of them at one point.
Thanks for finding Tree Hugger Podcast again and tuning into this discussion with Ann-Kathrin from the United Nations Environment Program. The Restoration Decade will officially launch on World Environment Day, June 5th, 2021. We'll see you there. Let's not continue with business as usual. Perhaps the biggest danger is that governments and corporations will stick the now trendy restoration label on projects that are merely cosmetic. I'm not convinced that engaging the same uninhibited neoliberalism that has caused the degradation will enable the reimagining of our relationship with nature to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. So we will see how it goes as the United Nations and others engage with governments, international lenders, development agencies, and private businesses on financing restoration at scale. Our challenge as restorationists is to embrace the imperative that is the human dimension and inclusion of different roles people can play. We do need the frontline disruptors, the complementary visionaries, health professionals, urban planners, as well as the experimenters, the builders, the caregivers, and the healers. To meet the highest aspirations and construct new society-nature relationships, We should acknowledge the emergence of authentic connections between us while also working to disregard hierarchies and the continuation of oppressive tendencies. There will be progress and setbacks, and I hope to be here to observe, take part in my own way, and hopefully report back to you on how the restoration decade progresses. It may be helpful not to look at progress in a linear way of knowing, but circular or in some Jeremy Bearimy fashion. If you watch The Good Place, you'll know what I'm talking about. Otherwise, Chapter 31, 5th episode of Season 3, The Good Place. Check it out. Thanks for joining me again for another episode of Tree Hugger Podcast. I'm Michael Yadrick. Please check the show description for information about Ann-Kathrin Neureuther. Or you can find out more about her online at treehuggerpod.com. We are on social media at treehuggerpod, so feel free to point people in our direction. Subscribe, rate, and review the show, please, on whichever podcast platform you enjoy listening to. It helps people find the show. Or tell a friend about the show. If you're introverted and don't have friends, just tell someone random on a Zoom call. You can now donate to the show, too. At the Tree Hugger website, there's a PayPal link. Podcasting isn't free, people. If you're in the position to donate some funds, it would help to offset some of the show's costs. Thanks for considering. The music for the show I found on the YouTube audio library. You heard from Ano Domini Beats and Chiel. One can find a link to them in the show description. Thanks for hanging out, Generation Restoration.